get started. Can everyone see me? Lift up your fingers if you can see me. Awesome. Welcome and thank you all so very much for joining us for today's Zoom conference with Bill Whittle titled The Cold War, What We Saw. My name is Rabbi Zalman Mendelson and I serve as the co-director of the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming, together with my dear wife Razy, and our mission is to share the warmth, beauty, wisdom of Jewish tradition and general wisdom with the public in an effort to be able to create greater awareness about life, about joy, about purpose, and general wisdom. While the Cold War brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, the Jewish community in America, Israel, and the former Soviet Union banded together to support the Jewish community behind the Iron Curtain. One person in particular, my mentor and teacher, the Rebbe of blessed memory, worked tirelessly to care for the well-being of Russian Jewry. To add to the overall discussion for this evening, I'd like to begin with a short film about the Jewish struggle for survival behind the Iron Curtain and the Rebbe's heroic efforts. Please give me a moment and enjoy. Can you click start? We will not be playing the whole 29 minutes. We will be playing less than 10 minutes of this.
A regime which persecutes the Jewish religion must meet its end eventually. Ultimately, God will destroy them. But until then, we will suffer greatly from their wickedness and their libels. Yosef Yitzchak, you must sacrifice your life for strengthening Torah and Judaism.
For 70 years, across the USSR, organized religion was banned. Religious Jews were hunted and persecuted. Under the communist regime, in a land spanning 11 time zones, with the highest Jewish population in the world, thousands of shuls, schools, and mikvahs were shut down. 8 million Jews were being choked off from the heritage of their fathers. On a dark night in Moscow in the winter of 1924, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the 6th Rebbe of Lubavitch, made a covenant with a group of young men. They vowed to fight to the end to preserve their religion for the Jews of the Soviet Union, even if it meant losing their lives. Under the Rebbe's leadership, an organized underground of hundreds of Cheder elementary schools, yeshivas, and mikvahs sprung up from St. Petersburg in the west to Tashkent in the east. These dedicated men and women managed to keep the spark of Yiddishkeit alive in hundreds of towns and cities across the land. The communists persecuted, chased, and harassed the Rebbe and his operatives. Often within days, a new mikveh would be filled with cement. A report would arrive of a teacher sent to the firing squad, his young students sent to Siberia. But there always seemed to be another Hussid ready to fill his shoes. Years of communism, hundreds of Hasidic activists were executed. Thousands more were arrested and sent to Siberia for years of hard labor. In 1927, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak himself was arrested and sentenced to capital punishment. Through the intervention of the governments of the United States, Germany, and Latvia, and petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of Jews across the Soviet Union, the sentence was commuted. The Rebbe was banished from Russia. In 1939, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, father of the seventh Rebbe, was imprisoned in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, for his counter-revolutionary work. Among other crimes, he had personally stood up to Premier Stolypin and refused to follow the Premier's orders to certify government-baked matzahs as kosher for Passover. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was exiled to a remote area of Kazakhstan. He passed away of his suffering in exile in 1944. He was buried 2,000 miles from his home in Almaty, Kazakhstan. In 1950, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, at 48 years old, became the Rebbe. Under his guidance, the struggle intensified. Not a day would go by when the Rebbe would not struggle for the Jews of Russia.
Und ich fragte, die was gefunden sich nach Mosach Barzel, was nicht über sehr schuld, aber sie noch nicht sicher gewesen zu der vollsten Möglichkeit von lernenden Teilen und bekam sein Mitzvah bis im
The Rebbe toiled endlessly for their physical and spiritual well-being. He sent couples posing as tourists, as clandestine shluchim, bringing strength and determination to his Russian underground. The couples would memorize hundreds of names and addresses. Russian border guards were left scratching their heads by Hasidic couples who would travel to Russia for a 2-week stay, laden down with kosher salami and Jewish books and films. The humanitarian aid was used to feed Jews in cities and shtetl across the land. The shluchim smuggled out film strips where Jews would request the Rebbe's blessings.
Ich will bitten der Rebbe, soll benten, der alle Kinder Хасидим Летсохар.
Rebbe, и благодарить тебя за просьбу, которую ты исполнил, и о которой я говорил в прошлый раз.
The Rebbe would debrief the shluchim for hours on end, often weeping upon hearing the reports of physical and spiritual persecution. Perhaps more than anything else, the message the shluchim brought the Jews of Russia was that someone on the other side of the curtain remembered and cared. Someone would not sleep and would not rest until they would be free from their bondage. In 1989, the shackles began to break open with the fall of communism and perestroika. Immediately, the Rebbe began to dispatch shluchim to bring Judaism above ground, with restriction on religion being officially released. The ashes, glowing for 70 years, finally burst into flame. The warmth of Judaism began to glow for the millions of Jewish men, women, and children across Russia who didn't even know the meaning of the word Jew. Schools, shuls, mikvahs, and community centers began to spring up. Once again, children were laughing in the hallways of Jewish schools. An entire Jewish infrastructure has sprung up from the embers which were kept alive for 70 years.
Hello.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that short film. A few housekeeping items before we begin our interview with Bill Whittle. First, I'd like to thank Leon Clark for the time, effort, and grace he put into making this evening possible. Secondly, I'd like to share with you an upcoming event. Please mark your calendars and share with your friends. On June 2nd at 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, we will be hosting an event titled Iran's Regional Ambitions and the Implications for Israel with Professor David Menshari, founding director of the Lions Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. The schedule this evening will begin with a 30-minute interview with Bill Whittle. During the 30-minute interview, please send in your questions in the chat box that you would like Bill to answer today. please do not send in questions that are partisan in current political nature or current political issues. We at Chabad believe in including everyone and hope that this event brings our community together. After the formal interview is over, we will ask as many of the questions that come into the chat box as possible. As you know, many in the Jewish community today are struggling now during these uncertain times. And so we ask of you to please consider a one-time tax-deductible contribution to the Rabbi's Discretionary Fund so we can support our community during this time with dignity. Finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce a very dear friend of ours, Leon Clark, to conduct this evening's interview. Please put your hands together for Leon.
Thank you, Rabbi, for helping to put this event together, and thank you, Razy, for the design on the advertisement. Bill Whittle is the eldest son of an American hotel manager and a British BOAC stewardess. He was born in New York City, grew up in Bermuda and Florida, and was a theater major at the University of Florida before moving to Los Angeles, which has been his home since 1988. Bill has been employed as a planetarium writer and operator, security guard, waiter, carbon-14 lab assistant, hotel front desk clerk, office temp, aircraft manufacturer, limousine driver, professional comedy writer, film director, television editor, glider launch director, author, political commentator, public speaker, and has provided commentary for many national and international media outlets. In July of 2019, Bill wrote and presented a 4-part special on the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. In his first venture into the world of podcasting, all 4 episodes of Apollo 11, What We Saw, reached the top 5 on iTunes podcasts for any subject worldwide. Most recently, released at the beginning of this year, Bill has written a 13-part podcast, The Cold War, What We Saw. This series has been extremely well received with listeners and followers asking for more. In his free time, Bill is an amateur historian, computer graphics artist, and is a 1,000-hour instrument-rated owner and pilot of experimental aircraft. He married internationally known photographer Natalia Melnikova in 2016. Although I was born after the Cold War, I believe it is vital to preserve the memory of what took place behind the Iron Curtain. In Judaism, we are commanded to never forget what the Amalekites did to us. And in our times, we never forget the crimes of Haman, the Greeks, and more recently, the Nazis. It is humanity's duty to remember what took place behind the Iron Curtain and in the satellite nations. On that note, I encourage all of you to check out Mr. Whittle's excellent podcast titled The Cold War, What We Saw. My favorite part of the podcast, however, was not what we saw, but what they saw, what the Soviets saw, the Cold War from the Soviet point of view, and that's where I'd like to begin. Mr. Whittle, we are all familiar with the American attitude towards the world. We're open, we want peace, we're free, and unburdened by our history. What was the Soviet attitude, both internally and in terms of their outlook towards the world?
It's actually hard to imagine a better case of a negative image of America's attitudes than the Soviet Union. There are certain things that we have in common with the Russian people, but our worldview, just the general gestalt about how we feel where we are in the world, regardless of what the specific political issue is, I don't think could be more opposed. And I think that was the source of so much of the 48-year, 47-year conflict, was that both sides were essentially negative images of the other and had a very, very difficult time believing that the motivations that they themselves felt weren't felt by the other side. The short answer for this, Leon, is if you don't grow up in America, you do not appreciate the psychological comfort provided by the 2 largest bodies of water on the planet. We have one of the longest, might be the longest national border in the world. I suspect it is actually with Canada, which couldn't be a better friend. The border with Mexico is a little more problematic, but it's certainly not an invasion route. So we sit here on the other side of the world about as secure as you can be geographically. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, not only connects to so many of the quarrels in Europe. It is the bridge that extends across all of Asia and connects to all of the struggles with Asia as well. Russia's been invaded by the Chinese, the Japanese, the Mongols, everybody around the perimeter. I don't remember exactly how many countries Russia proper touches. I want to say it's 11. But again, it's about as perfect a negative image of America as you could possibly hope to see.
It seems almost silly to think of the US as having like global aspirations of domination. What threat did the USSR see in America?
I think this is the most important point in terms of understanding the Cold War. I really think it's really this simple. America does not and did not have any territorial ambitions on the Soviet Union or really pretty much anywhere else, with a possible exception of Hawaii. We bought Alaska from the Russians. Because of this, and because we have essentially never been invaded, we had the British burn the White House in the War of 1812, but that wasn't exactly a massive psychological scar on the country. In the way that perhaps the Civil War was. So we've never been invaded. And we in America sit upon what is, in my opinion, the prime real estate on planet Earth, just in terms of beauty, natural resources, its seclusion, all of it. It's the spot to be in. And so there was never, ever any intention of invading the Soviet Union. And because the Soviets constantly acted as if we were about to, we had a 48-year-long standing conflict. Now, let's look at it from the other side. In contrast to America, which had essentially never been invaded, the Russian people had always been invaded. It is just an ongoing part of their history, goes back well before the communists, goes back before the Romanovs. It is nothing but conquest. The memory of Moscow burning as it was captured by Napoleon, and then needless to say, a century or a little more than a century after that, when Adolf Hitler turned the Wehrmacht on Russia and killed at least 20 million people, probably another 20 million civilians. The idea of somebody not wanting to invade the Soviet Union was beyond their emotional horizon, in the same way that the desire to invade them was beyond the American emotional horizon. And there was a half a century of these two sides looking at each other and not being able to do the fundamental thing you need to do in diplomacy and warfare, and that is put yourself in the mindset of your opponent. And while we tried to do that on a strategic level in terms of military, I don't think we ever culturally quite got to the idea that we were honest to God, hanging on to opposite ends of the rope, and that invasion was out of the question for us, and the lack of invasion was out of the question for the Soviet Union. It just, that's the equation right there.
The more I read about the Cold War, the more amazing the peaceful fall of the USSR appears to me. Was the downfall of the USSR and its non-violent end caused mainly by internal or external factors?
Well, it was caused by both. And I certainly understand the nature of your question, how it's phrased by saying nonviolent, to the degree that unlike the revolution that started the Soviet Union, there was no violence, nobody was killing anybody, nobody went in with guns and arms. But I have to take issue with the idea that the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, was nonviolent. It's just that the violence was spread out over 72 years or something. You can only execute so many of your own people. You can only intimidate and belittle and degrade so many of your own people before you create a situation where the entire edifice has been hollowed out from the inside. And that had been going on pretty much from the beginning of the Soviet Union. A lot of people tend to assume that it was Stalin that brought brutality to the Soviet Union. But it was Lenin who established the Cheka, the secret police. It was Lenin who had the first of the show trials. It was Lenin who understood that people who were being put on trial were innocent of any crimes. And it was Lenin who openly said, along with Trotsky, that terror is the mechanism by which we can create and continue to rule this country. And that's their words, not mine. Now, with all that said, you're right. It wasn't an American invasion or an invasion of any kind. It did collapse from within, but that balloon got a pop from the outside, and that balloon was primarily in the form of three world leaders, I think. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II. And while neither of the three launched a military campaign against the Soviet Union, what all three of them did prominently, and many, many others as well, was they were finally willing, after half a century, to understand that this was not a military conflict. It was a moral conflict. It was a moral conflict. And by calling the Soviet Union what it was, he not only he heartened the entire Russian people who had been so oppressed and been so browbeaten by this. I'm not saying that the Russians aren't patriotic. They are extraordinarily patriotic people. But there was so much about that society that caused cognitive dissonance. So much of America is just a bunch of bandits and idiots, and yet America's rich, and the Soviet Union is the greatest land in the world, and yet we can't feed our own people, and we have lines. It's 40 degrees below zero outside, and babushkas waiting in line for 5 hours to buy bread. They couldn't square that circle. And so it was finally, I think, the ability of those politicians to come out and say, this is not just an ideological enemy, it is a moral abomination. And to be perfectly honest with you, Leon, my major objective in the entire Cold War series was to tell the story, not so much as military or political history, but to tell it from a moral perspective. When you hear about the Cold War, people tend to say, well, it was, the Reds and the Blues, and it's kind of like Coke versus Pepsi, that there's no moral distinction between the two. But that's absolutely, absolutely feloniously mistaken.
On that note, I feel like I was failed by my educational system. I grew up in England, but I've met Americans that feel the same way. Mm-hmm. Because although I learned about the USSR and communist China, it was taught very matter-of-factly. I never felt the moral weight of the millions slaughtered and starved, and the crimes of the satellite nations like Cambodia, North Korea, and Cuba. If anything, it was almost romanticized at times. Yep. If we ever did discuss the Cold War through a moral lens, there was a moral equivalency. Why is the West afraid of its identity as a victor, and more importantly, as the good guys?
This is the question. For most of the Cold War, there was not a real conflict about it. For most of the Cold War, the huge majority of the American people clearly understood that we were fighting what was commonly referred to as godless communism, and that there was no question whatsoever that this was a worthy fight in terms of something that needed to be fought. Certainly those perspectives changed after Vietnam. But if you want what I think the clearest answer is I think that it took a full generation for the West to begin to feel suicidally ashamed and responsible for the Holocaust, the entire West. There are actions that are being taken in Europe today that are virtually inexplainable in terms of any rational policy for those particular nations. And so many people who study this a little more closely than I did felt that the overall lack of confidence in the West that continued and grew throughout the Cold War was due largely, specifically because of Vietnam and the barbarity that was going on over there. But on a larger sense, I think as the Cold War evolved, the entire idea of somebody saying we're right and they're wrong became anathema, at least to intellectuals. And the intellectuals, the professors, and so on, I think believe that if you taught kids that we're right and they're wrong, all you're doing is creating an entire new generation of soldiers and Hitler Youth and all the rest of these things. But I really do think that's it. I think that a lot of professors, well, this is not a opinion of mine, this is just clearly true. A large number of college professors were sympathetic to the Soviet Union as an idea. And this went on for the entire, not just the 48 years of the Cold War. We should remember that the Soviet Union existed for 30 years prior to becoming an adversary of the US, and the Soviet Union was our primary ally during World War II against the Nazis. But that idea, I think, the images of Hitler Youth, the images of these blonde kids just being indoctrinated, and that, you know, we're right and they're wrong, there's no gray area here, I think that repelled a lot of Americans, and rightfully so. But I think that a lot of college professors remained in love with the idea of the Soviet Union and loved the idea of it so much that they were willing to overlook everything. And that is where they have failed enormously. I grew up in Bermuda. I went to British schools. And one of the things they taught us was how to think critically. And one of the things I learned in debate in high school was that no matter what the topic was, in my senior year, it was prison reform. You had to, at the flip of a coin, be prepared to be affirmative or negative on any one particular issue, the death penalty, for example. And what I learned in debate was that if I wanted to prove that the death penalty does in fact deter other murderers, I could find thousands of cases of evidence that said that. And if I wanted to prove that it didn't, I could find thousands of cases of evidence that proved that too. I could come into a room with fistfuls of index cards, both of them by experts, both of them well-funded studies with excellent methodology, and they both proved the exact opposite of each other. And so when we talk about the Soviet Union and whether or not we were the good guys and they were the bad guys, you can have this theoretical discussion with the index cards, and people can say, no, they were great, and people can say, no, they were terrible. And that's just an opinion. But what's not an opinion is the fact that nobody ever got shot going over the Berlin Wall to get into East Berlin. What's not an opinion is that no dentist ever took his family down to the beach in Fort Lauderdale and lashed together a bunch of chase lounges with inner tubes and put grandma and the baby on there and pushed off into the water off the coast of Florida so that they could sail south for the free healthcare and the universal literacy. That never happened. All of the rafts are moving from Cuba to America. It's not 50-50, it's not 60-40, it's not 90-10, it's not 95-5. 100% of the people that risked their lives, and many of them died at sea, many of them did it to move in one direction. Same thing was true in Europe, and that's not an opinion. That is people voting with their feet and voting with their lives. And to me, that is incontrovertible evidence of the moral superiority, not the moral perfection by any means, but the moral superiority of the West with regard to the Soviets.
The more I learn about the Cold War, the more parallels I see with the stories of Hanukkah and Purim. Each time we were confronted by an enemy that wanted us to live on our knees and give up our way of life and religion. But in each case, a few people had the moral courage to stand up to the enemy, and ultimately, a miracle of God saved us. And the fact that the world didn't end in nuclear Armageddon, to me, in the Cold War is divine intervention. How close did we really come to all-out nuclear war?
You can make a pretty compelling case, Leon, that there were two incidents during the span that was officially known as the Cold War. You make a pretty compelling case that there were two incidents that went an awful long way to prove the existence of a God. Now, both of these incidents that I'll relate to you are fascinating, and both of them were cases where a Russian used his moral authority to essentially save the world. And I'll be perfectly honest with you about this. When I realized that in both these cases that it was a Russian both times, I was actually a little jealous almost, you know. It's like, how come it was, you know, the Russian guys that stood up and stopped what would have been a world war, just Armageddon, nuclear Armageddon. And I came to realize that the reason that it was Russians both times was that because of the rigid nature of the Soviet Union, the Russian military operated on a system completely different than the US system. And the Russian system in a short form, in terms of their military, can be summed up like this. If A, then B, period. No discretion. If an American destroyer drops a depth charge on a Russian sub, you will launch the nuclear torpedo. It's not up to the captain. If A, then B. If we see incoming American warheads on a radar screen, we launch on warning. We don't wait for them to impact. It's not up to you. This has been decided in the Kremlin. If A, then B, no wiggle room, no debate, period. 2 times during the Cold War, the if A, then B mentality of the Soviet military forces nearly brought the entire world to utter nuclear destruction. The first time occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's not a part of the Cuban Missile Crisis that anybody knows about. As the Americans with Kennedy and Khrushchev were negotiating this thing away, this is at the end of the crisis now, not at the beginning, as everything was being negotiated away and temperatures were starting to come down, the US maintained what was a blockade. They called it a quarantine zone. That was just public relations. An act of a blockade is an act of war, but this is welcome to the age that the Soviets were masters of this kind of thing. But there was an exclusion zone around the island of Cuba, and it was still in effect. It turns out that there were, I want to say 4, it might have been 3, but there were 4, I think, Russian subs, conventional subs, diesel electric subs, that were approaching the quarantine zone. And since they're deep underwater, they cannot get radio signals from the surface. So they don't know that this crisis is over or nearly over. They don't know. As these Russian boats approached the exclusion zone, an American destroyer detected one of them. And because the crisis was de-escalating, the American destroyer dropped something called, I think it was called a measuring charge. It's something like that. It's basically a test depth charge. And instead of, if you think of the old World War II movies as a depth charge being like a giant oil barrel filled with explosives, this is essentially an oil barrel with the explosive power of like a hand grenade. It just goes pop. It is utterly incapable of damaging the submarine. It's simply there for training purposes so that the sonar guys and the launching guys can get some practice. So basically, this US destroyer put down a line of these dummy depth charges. They had no explosive power, but the people in the Russian submarine didn't know that. Certainly no harm was ever given to the Soviet sub, but the commanders on that sub had an order, and that is that if an American destroyer ever drops depth charges on you, given what had happened with Soviet subs having to surface and all of the disgrace and all the rest of it, each one of those 4 boats, conventional boats, carried 1 nuclear tipped torpedo. Every one of the 4 had one nuclear tipped torpedo. And in order to launch that torpedo, authorization for the launch of the nuclear tipped torpedo had to come from the captain and the first officer, the executive officer. And on the boat that was in question, when the American destroyer dropped those dummy charges, both the captain and the executive officer agreed that they need to launch the nuclear torpedo. They were going to launch it. They were in full agreement about it. They didn't know if there was a world at the surface. They'd been underwater for days and watching the tension rise. So they were preparing to launch this nuclear tipped torpedo against a US destroyer in the middle of the exclusion zone, in the middle of the US Navy, at the height of the Cold War's greatest crisis. They had their fingers ready to go on the button. By a 1 out of 4 chance, there was a 3rd person on that boat, and that was the captain of the entire squadron. You might want to think of him as a submarine admiral. He wasn't commanding that particular sub, but he was commanding all 4 subs. And he happened to be on that boat. And he had been a hero on the first Soviet submarine, which had horrible radiation leakage and damage, and was a very, very brave man. And they needed 2 people, the captain and the executive officer, to launch that nuclear torpedo, except on that 1 boat out of the 4. That boat, they needed all 3. And he refused to do it. He simply refused to do it. He said, we have no idea what's going on. We're still intact. We heard some splashes in the water. I will not grant it. And the captain and the executive officer and this man got into a shouting match and nearly drew pistols on each other, but he refused to authorize what would have been already launched in any of the other 3 boats that were in that area at the same time. So that's it. I mean, if that man hadn't been there, they would have launched that nuclear tipped torpedo against the US Navy destroyer, and that almost, it's inconceivable, given the level of tension, that wouldn't have escalated to full-on nuclear exchange. That was in 1963. There's another time in 1987, and again, same situation, but completely different location. In 1987, there was a Russian radar installation in the general vicinity of Kamchatka on the eastern border of the Soviet Union. And this was the area where Flight 007 had overflown Soviet territory and been shot down. The 747 with hundreds of people had been shot out of the sky by the Soviets. This was an enormous scandal. And they were very, very sensitive in this area. And the guy who happened to be on duty, and I'm ashamed of myself to say that I've forgotten his name. I'm deeply ashamed of myself, but it's just flown out of my head. The colonel who was in charge of that particular base was on the night shift, and it was late at night, another boring night as it had been for 30 years. And all of a sudden, on his main screen, there are these two signs that light up in flashing red, backlit, and in Cyrillic letters that say launch, launch. His computer showed 5 American warheads inbound for the Soviet Union. He was under extremely strict orders that he was to launch on detection. In other words, he sees them coming in. There's probably a 15-minute, 12-minute window before they actually impact, but he's not going to wait that long. One of the key complications of the Cold War was this idea of a decapitation strike. If you launched your strike first, you could take out, this was the idea, you could take out enough of the enemy's nuclear capacity that their counterstroke would be survivable, and you'd only lose 30 million people instead of, 100. But because the first strike gave either side such enormous advantage, the Soviets had given this commander, like all the rest of them, if A, then B. If you detect these incoming American warheads, you will fire your missiles in response. And on that particular night, at that particular station, was a man who simply didn't believe it was possible. He simply wouldn't believe it. And again, he's got his subordinates screaming and yelling. People are threatening pistols and calling him a traitor, and the pressure is enormous. And he's saying, we are going to wait until those missiles hit the ground. If they hit the ground, then we will launch our missiles, but we are not going to do what I am ordered to do. Now, in order to fully understand the courage that took, you have to know that he knows that the entire history of his country has been to take people who so much as even talk to foreigners and take them away and shoot them, and shoot every member of their family and disappear the entire family. And entire families in Russia, virtually every family in Russia during the Soviet Union, would have photo albums like any of the rest of us would. And as you flip through the photo albums, as the years went by, you would see more and more faces that had been erased with the eraser on a pencil, because they didn't want to be associated with somebody who had been accused of being an enemy of the state. They weren't, but they'd been taken out and shot. So you got to understand that when this guy refused to launch those missiles as per his order, same with the Soviet subcommander, that he knew that if he was wrong, not only would he be executed, his family would be executed, everybody he knew would be executed, and that was the small part. By the way, in '63, when the subcommander got back to the Soviet Union, and of course, needless to say, it turned out that was not an attack. The guy who saved the world the first time reported to the Soviet Navy, and the admiral in charge of the Soviet Navy slammed his fist down on the table and demanded to know why he didn't launch that nuclear torpedo that would have ended the world. Anyway, this man just decided that he just couldn't imagine it being true. So he waited for 12 minutes, and then he made some phone calls and called the areas where these missiles had shown to be impacted on his radar screens. And sure enough, people answered the phone, and he'd ask them to look outside and, what's the temperature, comrade? And maybe it's 10 degrees below zero instead of 90,000 degrees. And so it turned out that all these installations were still there. It was a computer error. It was a computer bug from a training device. And that's not the point. The point is his orders were launch on detection, and he didn't do it. And I have to tell you, honestly, Leon, and everybody else that's listening, this is so controversial I didn't even put it in the series, because I really just couldn't come up with an answer I felt I could stand on. But given those two examples, it's entirely possible that the nuclear Armageddon might have been impossible. I know people think that it's like we escape by the skin of our teeth, but having seen those two instances, it got me wondering if it was ever possible in the first place. In other words, the consequences were so unbelievably abhorrent and high that it's almost impossible to see how somebody could do it. Clearly, there are people in the military who are ready to do it, no question about that. But Eisenhower and Kennedy and all the rest of the American presidents had to convince the Russians that they would launch. If the Soviets launched a full-scale nuclear attack, we would respond. But there's a significant amount of evidence that many of them, if not all of them, would not have done it. I mean, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're taken down to the White House bunker and 15 minutes later you've lost all your American cities and 200 million Americans are dead, and your only choice now is to send an order to kill 150, 200 million Russians. It's not going to do anything to bring back the American lives. It's not going to do anything to bring back those cities. Do you launch? Nobody knows, and we didn't have to find out. But what had to happen was the Russians had to believe that there was a credible chance that we would. And we had to believe that there was a credible chance that they would. And the reason that it was two Russians that saved the world was because errors happened on both sides all throughout the Cold War, but the Americans never had an if A then B ironclad kind of a thing. If an American sub had gotten an order to launch, let's say, or a bomber was on its way and missed its fail-safe point, there was still a great deal there was the circuit breaker left in the system that consisted of the human soul. You know, there was a guy in that bomber. There was a man in that submarine. There was a living person there that was making those decisions. And yeah, if those two Russian individuals had not been on duty on those two shifts during those 2 days, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We'd all be radioactive dust in the upper stratosphere right now.
Okay, let's go to Q&A then.
Thank you, Bill, for that phenomenal, fascinating presentation. That was amazing. We're going to move along now to Q&A.
My pleasure.
Where we'll take questions from people on our social media platforms as well as here on Zoom.
Fantastic.
Anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask, please send them in and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. I'm going to actually call upon Andy, since you wrote your question in already. I'd like for you to ask, you've sent some private messages. If you can just ask one of them, and if we have time to get to some of the other ones, we will. But in the meantime, let's get to your first question that you asked. Please unmute yourself, Andy.
I'm unmuted, but I'm trying to get back to my question. I think I asked.
It started with if Stalin believed the U.S. wished to invade the Soviet Union.
Yeah, if Stalin actually believed after World War II that the United States fundamentally wanted to attack and destroy the Soviet Union, how did he explain to himself the precipitous disarmament of the U.S. military in the late 40s? How did he interpret that as anything else but an opportunity to take Berlin, to take Korea, to take Western Europe? I don't see how Stalin actually, he was a very cynical and realistic leader. I don't see how he could possibly have imagined that the United States was scheming to attack Russia after World War II.
That's a great question. Stalin's, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin disappeared for 10 days. He simply disappeared. He went to his dacha. When a committee that consisted of Malenkov and Khrushchev and Molotov and all the rest went over to Stalin's dacha to see what had happened to him, Stalin looked at them as if he was about to be arrested and executed. And when they said, "We want you to come back and lead the war effort against the Nazis," Stalin was, you could just watch the relief. They thought they were coming to shoot him. He had so badly miscalculated for so long with regard to the Nazis and with Hitler. Now, I don't think that Stalin expected that the US was going to invade Soviet territory And if I gave the impression that that it was a military invasion, that's not necessarily the case. What Stalin did know, however, was that his country was surrounded by successful economies that were growing rapidly, and his wasn't, and neither were his satellite nations. The short form, to be honest with you, Andy, is that at the end of World War II, at the time of the Potsdam Conference, Nazi Germany had already surrendered. Japan was a couple months away. Stalin looked at the board, looked at his enormous country, and basically said, all right, how do things look? Things look good in the East. We're strong there. Japan is on its knees. America's going to defeat the Japanese, no question about that. Not too worried about China. China's backwards, been decimated by the Japanese. And he looked at Europe, and he basically saw that the Red Army, which by the time of April of 1945 were conventional forces of unbelievable magnitude, millions of men under arms, tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, all of them deployed in Western Europe by this point. You're in halfway in Germany. You're at Berlin. You're all across, all throughout the south of the Baltics, all yours. And there's compelling evidence that Stalin thought that there would be a 2 or 3 year period of consolidation. He knew that the Americans didn't have the stomach to go and fight another war against their former allies. They wouldn't, just the amount of time it would take to get overseas wouldn't do it. And then there were the 2 flashes over Japan. And all of a sudden, everything that Stalin had calculated on was completely inverted. In other words, all of the conventional forces that he had husbanded and built and committed and sacrificed, all of this incredible, unbelievable conventional strength in Europe at April of 1945 was instantly, millisecond, over Hiroshima, rendered useless, rendered obsolete. The American invention of the atomic bomb absolutely equalized the pan. The preponderance of Soviet conventional forces in Europe at the end of World War II is so overwhelming, it's hardly something I can convey. But here's what America did have at the end of World War II. Stalin had enormous numbers of troops on the ground. He had enormous numbers of tanks, and he had some ground attack aircraft. The United States, on the other hand, had a Navy, had the Navy. We had a fleet of nuclear capable bombers, and we had the atomic bomb, and we demonstrated that we had the will to use it. And that negated at a stroke all of his calculations. Now, for the first time in history, and the reason we haven't fought any existential wars since the end of World War II is because nuclear weapons have an unusual secondary or tertiary effect. And one of the effects of nuclear weapons is that the people who make the decisions go to war are the first ones to be killed, not the last ones to be killed. That is an interesting change of perspective. When Stalin realized what the Americans had, he realized that all of his conventional forces were essentially politically useless. They certainly could have overrun Europe. There's no question about that. It's just a given. And that's exactly what he expected to happen. But once you have American B-29s with nuclear bombs, you realize that, yes, in order to finish the conquest of all of Europe, it's going to cost me Moscow. It's going to cost me St. Petersburg. It's going to cost me Smolensk. It's going to cost me Novosibirsk. It's going to cost me Vladivostok and Sevastopol. It's all going to go away. There is no win anymore. And that happened like that in the space of 3 or 4 days. It took Stalin at least a full year or two to understand really viscerally how much things have changed. And then we see the beginning of the Cold War, which was nothing but an ongoing series of the Soviet Union testing the resolve of the West, and the Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade is a superb example of that. I can go into details about the Berlin blockade. It's a very interesting insight into the Cold War, but I don't want to just run on about that question. So if somebody else wants to ask about it.
Thank you very much. Yes, we will move along to another question. Jerry Wolfset messaged in a question. Jerry, can you come on, unmute yourself and please ask your question? Jerry, can you hear me?
There he is.
Ooh. I think we clicked mute and unmute at the same time. I was trying to unmute you and you were doing it yourself. I'm going to let you handle it. It looks like you know what you're doing. Please unmute yourself, Jerry.
It's like two people trying to unlock the car door at the same time. That whole roundabout.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, go ahead, please. Ask your question.
The American military mislead the Americans in the belief that the Russian military was equal to or superior to our forces during the Cold War.
I missed the first part of that, Jerry. I'm sorry. It's a little
It's a
scratchy.
little bit unclear on Jerry's end. Let me try to take over this question, Jerry,
Sure.
and hopefully I do a good job with reading what you had sent in, if that's okay with you. Why did the American military mislead the American public as to the capability of the Russian military when Russia was way behind us?
Well, first of all, we go back to the question that we just discussed. There is no question that the United States overestimated the Soviet missile capability in the beginnings of the Cold War in the late 50s and early 60s, significantly overestimated it. But you have to understand where those people are coming from. This is not like we had the information and knew it. One of the things that I spent the most time on during the Cold War was the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71, the Corona satellite surveillance systems. These were things that I found incredibly interesting. But these were strategic assets, and there was a very tough decision on the part of Eisenhower to overfly the Soviet Union, which is another act of war, really, in order to get the photography that he needed to know what was actually happening on the ground. Now, by the time that Eisenhower began to get data on just how far behind they were in terms of Russia's missiles, nuclear missiles, you have to understand that we have already by this point been through the Berlin blockade. We've been through the Korean War. We have seen naked Soviet aggression, communist aggression across the world, and those conventional forces in Europe never ever went away. It's not like we built down after World War II. The United States dismantled a military on a scale that's never been seen before, and I'm sure never will be seen again. We were the ones, the Americans were the ones who disarmed. We basically took those bombers and cut them up and turned them into soda cans, and we took most of our Navy and turned them into razor blades. The Soviets continued to build conventional strength. So since the American presidency and the American intelligence services didn't know, they did see what they could see. And what they could see was increasing numbers of conventional forces. Certainly the Soviets had the nuclear bomb, and the H-bomb years ahead of when we thought they would have had it because of basically because of the Soviet spy system. So yes, it's true. The American people were told that there was a missile gap and that we were behind the Russians in terms of nuclear warheads. But this is information that we have after the fact, and was a significant surprise to the Americans when we finally had intelligence assets like the U-2, and then later the first spy satellites. But let me just be clear on something here. When we talk about this, we could say that America, pick a year, we might have had 400 nuclear weapons, and the Soviets might have had 15. And that's how out of balance it was. But the thing that you cannot simply excuse is the aggressive stance of the Soviet Union since the instant that World War II ended. I mean, the Berlin blockade, prior to the Berlin blockade, the Soviets had broken all of their agreements that the three allies had made at Potsdam. The United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union had three major summits during World War II, come to the Potsdam Declaration and agreements at the end of World War II. And the Russians had done nothing but break every single one of those things. They had been continuing to build up their conventional forces while we had disassembled ours. And we knew they had the nuclear bomb. So if the criticism is that America overreacted to this, it's a valid criticism, but to claim it as a lie just doesn't seem to hold up historically to me.
Thank you very much for that. It is well known that the tragedy for the Jewish community in Russia was a tragedy of epic proportions. The loss of life, the Siberian winters, the gulags, etc., etc.
Can I interrupt you for a second on this point, Mr. Mendelsohn, on this specific point?
Please.
In the days before Stalin died, by this point they had seen what these purges looked like. The Great Terror was in 1937 when the Communist Party started eating their own. But there had been enough of these waves of mass executions and the elimination of the kulaks in the late 20s and the 30s, the elimination of the Red Army in the 30s and so on. There were signs that people knew what this was going to look like. And as Stalin was dying, he had already instigated something called the doctor's plot, where he had basically made the case that a cabal of Jewish doctors had secretly murdered a number of Communist Party officials in their care. And it was clear to everybody who was on the inside of that what Stalin was preparing to do was to launch a program the likes of which had not been seen in the Soviet Union. That the doctor's plot and a massive, I mean just a massive move against what was left of Soviet Jews was aborted by Stalin having a stroke. And if he hadn't, the numbers that are already horrific would have been more so, significantly more so, if such a thing's imaginable.
Well, thank you for that additional piece of context and information. I just wanted to essentially, for me and many in our community, we have family or friends that were victims of Stalin's brutality. And so we're familiar with the books and the history and the reading on the Jewish experience in communist Russia. Stalin famously said that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Could you guide us towards any particular book, poem, a place to visit, something to read about, something to think about, a film of some sort that could help us properly understand what really went on in this terrible dictatorship?
Solzhenitsyn described the Gulag system as an archipelago because there were over 400 camps scattered throughout the largest country in the world, and it resembled a string of islands that were connected to each other. The most notorious of the gulags was called Kolyma, and it was in the eastern part of the Soviet Union and very far north. Kolyma, one camp out of 400 plus. The best estimates of the number of people killed at Kolyma probably comes out to about 800,000 people killed there. Now, they weren't killed in gas chambers, but they were sent out to work on a food budget of 200 calories a day. They were sent out to break rocks or mine uranium in 40 degrees below zero, which coincidentally, 40 degrees below zero is the one point where the Celsius and Fahrenheit scales converge. Negative 40 Fahrenheit and negative 40 Celsius are the same temperature, and that's the only place where that happens. When you take people who had been musicians and doctors and all of these people, and you give them a 200-300 calorie a day diet, 2,000 is generally considered to be sufficient nutrition. And you put them to work mining uranium or gold in the winter in the northern parts of Siberia, then calling it anything other than a death camp is sophistry. 800,000 people died there. That's the best guess at one camp. Now, this is a very awful calculation, and I feel unclean doing it, but if you take a look at the best estimate of numbers, you find the deadliest place in the world was Auschwitz with 1.2, 1.4 million people killed. Treblinka comes in second with 850,000, and Kolyma comes in third. Killed more Jews and more people, not just Jews, they killed more people in Kolyma than they did in Sobibor or in any of the other camps. And so why doesn't anybody know this? And the answer is, in my mind, extremely simple. The reason that the Soviets are not held to the same level of accountability that the Nazis were is because there are no pictures. It's just that simple. There's no photos, there's no pictures. all of this happened internally in the Soviet Union. The Nazi camps were liberated by the Russians and liberated by the Western Allies, the British and the Americans. And when they got there, they started rolling film. And those pictures were burned into the Western mind and will never leave us. Similar conditions in the Gulag happened so deep within Russia that there is no photographic record of any of it. And since there are no photographs, we can't connect to it. Stalin did say that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And the reason he said that, if you really break down what he said and really unpack it, what he's saying is you can know a person. You can know one person. If a person you know was taken out and killed, you know that person, you feel the pain of it. You can't know a million people. And you can't know 6 million people. And the reason that the Nazis have suffered the opprobrium that they deserve is because there were pictures. It wasn't just, hey, my uncle disappeared or I lost my 4 sons or anything. There were photographs. There were movies of bulldozers pushing piles of human bodies like cordwood. There were photographs and pictures. It happened, and you could go there and you could see it for yourself. And it's a well-known fact that that in one of the camps, which were minor camps, the Americans liberated the Soviets liberated all the major camps, Sobibor and Treblinka had basically been bulldozed by the end of the war. But it was the Soviets that really got to most of the actual death camps. But even the camps that the Americans got to, which were work camps, not specifically extermination camps, they worked millions of people to death, but they weren't specific extermination camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. When the Americans and the British saw what was going on there, they not only got their reporters there, they made the citizens of the nearby cities go to those camps and clear the bodies. And they took movie footage of German citizens coming out of one of these camps. And you can tell that these people are pretty upset. I don't write them a complete pass for this. Their neighbors just vanished and they just disappeared, and millions of them disappeared, and they didn't ask any questions, so there you go. But when they saw what actually happened, even the German people, as World War II is ending, were appalled at what they saw. And we never had a chance to have that experience with any of the camps in the Gulag system. Putting together a video version of this would be extremely difficult because there's such a sparse record of photographs from the Gulags. But nevertheless, 800,000 people went to Kolyma and didn't come back. And that is a crime that it is shameful to cover up, and I try to do my best to make sure that those people weren't forgotten.
Thank you very much for that. Gerald Wolfson, if you can close your mic so we don't if you can mute yourself, that would be great. I'd like to, there we go. I'm doing it for you. I'd like to just express my deepest sense of gratitude to Bill for this fantastic, informative presentation. I know, why is it now like this? I'm not sure. But I know that people who have joined us this evening would love to be able to follow up with you and connect with you, support your good work, stay in touch with you. What's the best way for people to be able to accomplish that? How can people remain connected with you?
Well, that's very kind of you. BillWhittle.com, W-H-I-T-T-L-E, all one word, BillWhittle.com is where all of my work goes. I do 50 shows a month. So we do 2 a day. The financial structure of BillWhittle.com is it's a membership-driven organization, but the remarkable thing about the people that have been drawn together by all of this work is that the members insisted that everything be made free. Even the members only content, they insisted that we made this public. So essentially what's happening in our company is we have a small number of people who are paying for these videos to be seen by hundreds of millions of people. We just got word the other day that we just my channel on YouTube passed 35 million, and most of the big work I did on other people's channels. So we're well over 100 million views now. And a small number of people pay either $9.95 a month or $19.95 a month at BillWhittle.com and become members. And those people keep us going. And the beautiful thing about that is I don't work for any one person. I work for thousands of people. And that allows me to say whatever I feel is true without having to have somebody to answer to. And my attitude, when I'm in my crankier moods, which is more and more often these days, if you look out the window, I like to say I'm never wrong, and I am never wrong. And the reason I'm never wrong is because I am not rooted to one spot. I am not stuck with a political system or opinions that I am holding on to for dear life. The reason I'm never wrong is because when I find that I'm in error, I change my mind and I move to where the truth is. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean I'm never wrong, but that's my attitude. My attitude is the truth is the truth, and no matter how difficult it may be, and I've been called some pretty nasty names that I didn't earn or deserve, my defense has always been if it is verifiably true, then speaking it is not only my duty but an honor and a privilege, and the verifiability of truth is my entire shield. If I am convinced that something is true, then I'm going to, by God, say it, and that was made possible by a very small number of the people who have seen the message. A very small number of people pay for other people to watch it for free. And if you want to help out and be one of those people, we'd be enormously grateful for it.
That's BillWhittle.com, BillWhittle.com.
Yes,
please visit his website, support his work. We deeply appreciate your phenomenal presentation tonight. Please, everyone, give a round of applause for Bill Whittle, and thank you so much for this opportunity. We learned a lot. We're grateful for your wisdom and your contribution. Have a wonderful night, everyone, and thank you, Bill, once again.
Thank you for the kind words and the superb questions. They were really excellent. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.